I found my own obituary already printed inside my son's desk, and according to it, I was supposed to die 3 days later. I didn't scream. I didn't drop the papers. I simply stood there, staring at a professionally written tribute that described me as a loving mother, devoted grandmother, and generous member of the community. It even mentioned my favorite hymn and listed the church where my memorial service would supposedly be held. The strangest part wasn't how detailed it was. The strangest part was that every sentence sounded exactly like something my son Michael would write. I folded the papers carefully before my hands could begin to shake. I never imagined that a simple favor would lead me to discover something that would change the way I looked at my family forever. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and let me know what city you're watching from, because I'd truly like to know how far this story travels. It had started as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Cedar Ridge, Ohio. At 71, my life had become pleasantly predictable. Every Tuesday, I baked blueberry muffins, watered the flowers on my porch, and stopped by Michael's insurance office after lunch if he needed anything. Since losing my husband Thomas 6 years earlier, helping my only son had become one of the few routines that still made me feel useful. Michael had called me that morning sounding distracted. "Mom, could you stop by the office? I left an insurance folder in my desk. Third drawer on the left. I need it before my meeting." "Of course, sweetheart," I replied without hesitation. I'd done similar favors dozens of times before. His office was quiet when I arrived. His assistant had already left for lunch, and Michael had stepped out to meet a client across town. The receptionist smiled warmly and pointed me toward his private office. "He said you'd know where everything is." I smiled back. For years, that sentence would have filled me with pride. I knew where everything was because I'd watched Michael build this business from nothing. I'd folded brochures in the early years, answered phones during flu season, and even cleaned the office when he couldn't afford a janitorial service. His success always felt like part of Thomas's legacy and mine. I walked into the office, breathing in the familiar scent of leather chairs and fresh coffee. Family photos lined the shelves. One showed Michael graduating from college. Another captured our last Thanksgiving together before Thomas passed away. There was even a framed picture of me holding my first granddaughter, Lily. Seeing those photographs made me smile. They reminded me that no matter how busy life became, family remained at the center of everything. At least, that was what I believed. I opened the third drawer exactly where Michael had said the folder would be. It wasn't there. I checked again, moving several neatly stacked files aside. Still nothing. Then I noticed the bottom of the drawer seemed uneven. A folder had slipped behind the metal rail. I reached farther than I intended, tugging at the corner until several papers suddenly slid forward and spilled across the hardwood floor. I bent down slowly, my knees reminding me that 71 wasn't the same as 50. As I gathered the papers, one page immediately caught my attention. My photograph stared back at me. It was the same picture Michael had taken of me on my 70th birthday, wearing a blue cardigan and laughing in the backyard. Above the photograph, in bold letters, were the words, "In loving memory of Evelyn Harper." My heart skipped so hard I actually grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. I kept reading because I couldn't stop. The obituary stated that I had passed away peacefully on Friday morning, 3 days from today. It described my life with remarkable detail, listed surviving relatives, included the church service schedule, and even thanked guests for charitable donations in lieu of flowers. Someone hadn't simply drafted a template. Someone had completed every detail. At the bottom of the final page, just above the printer timestamp, was a handwritten note in blue ink. "Approved for publication." My breath caught in my throat. Approved by whom? For what? Before I could think any further, I heard footsteps approaching outside the office. The door opened. Michael stood there, frozen, in place. His eyes dropped immediately to the obituary in my hands. For one long second, neither of us spoke. I waited for confusion. I expected panic. I even hoped he'd laugh and explain that it belonged to another client whose photograph had somehow been mixed up. Instead, his face remained strangely calm. He looked directly into my eyes and quietly asked, "Mom, why are you in my office?" Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush toward me or try to snatch the papers from my hands. Instead, he calmly stepped inside, closed the office door behind him, and looked at me with an expression that felt almost rehearsed. "Mom," he said again, forcing a small smile, "it's not what you think." I held the obituary between my trembling fingers. Then tell me what I'm supposed to think. He exhaled slowly and loosened his tie as though he had just walked into an inconvenient meeting. It's only a template. Estate attorneys prepare these things ahead of time. Harold suggested it months ago in case anything unexpected ever happened. I searched his face for the little signs I'd recognized since he was a boy. When Michael lied as a child, he'd scratch the back of his neck or avoid eye contact. Now he did neither. He simply looked tired. Too calm. Too prepared. A template? I asked quietly. With my photograph? My church? My favorite hymn? Even the date? His eyes flickered toward the final page before returning to mine. The date doesn't mean anything. Somebody probably typed it by mistake. I looked down again. Friday. 3 days away. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't crossed out. It had been entered neatly, as though someone expected it to happen. Michael stepped closer. Mom, please don't let this upset you. You know how paperwork is. Lawyers prepare every possibility. I wanted to believe him. Every mother wants to believe her child before believing her own fear. So I nodded, folded the obituary with deliberate care, and placed it back inside the folder. Maybe you're right, I said softly. Relief washed across his face so quickly that he didn't even try to hide it. He opened the proper drawer, retrieved the insurance file he'd originally asked for, and handed it to me. See? Wrong drawer. That's all. I smiled politely. Looks like I caused quite a mess. Don't worry about it. He walked me to the front door like nothing unusual had happened. Before I left, he kissed my forehead. Love you, Mom. Love you too, sweetheart. The words came automatically. They always had. Driving home through the quiet suburban streets of Cedar Ridge, I kept replaying the conversation in my mind. Michael had answered every question too quickly. He never asked which pages I had actually read. He never seemed surprised that I'd found them. Most of all, he never once apologized for how disturbing the document must have been. That wasn't like the little boy I'd raised. The following morning, I tried to put everything behind me. I watered my roses, read half a mystery novel on the porch, and convinced myself I was overreacting. After all, people my age often prepared advanced directives and funeral arrangements. Maybe this was simply another uncomfortable legal formality. Around noon, Lauren called. Hi, Evelyn, she said brightly. How are you feeling today? Perfectly fine. Good. That's wonderful. There was a brief pause before she continued. I've been thinking, have you ever decided where you'd want to be buried? The garden hose slipped slightly in my hand. Excuse me. Nothing urgent, she replied with a laugh that sounded just a little too polished. Michael and I were discussing how important it is for families to plan ahead. I forced a chuckle. I haven't exactly been shopping for cemeteries. Of course not. I was just curious. She quickly changed the subject to Lily's piano lessons before ending the call. I stood alone in my backyard for several minutes, staring at the blooming hydrangeas Thomas had planted years before he passed away. Lauren had never asked me about burial plans before, not once in 15 years. That evening, I opened my desk calendar to mark an upcoming doctor's appointment. A folded real estate advertisement slipped from between the pages. I almost threw it away until I noticed the address. It was my house. Across the front, in red letters, someone had written, Prime Listing. Opportunity. Confused, I turned the page over. A sticky note was attached. Available after Friday. Friday again. The same day printed on my obituary. My pulse quickened. I drove to the county recorder's website the next morning to check property listings, expecting to find nothing. My house wasn't officially for sale, but I did notice something else. A public notice showed that an appraisal company had scheduled an exterior valuation of my property for Monday, just 3 days after the date printed on the obituary. I sat back in my chair, trying to convince myself these were meaningless coincidences. Yet another memory surfaced. Over the past several months, Lauren had repeatedly encouraged me to simplify my belongings. You don't need such a big house anymore, she'd say. One day, all this will become overwhelming. At Thanksgiving, she'd casually asked whether I still kept the deed in the old fireproof safe. At Christmas, she'd wondered if I'd considered downsizing. During Easter dinner, she'd smiled and said, big houses become difficult after a certain age. Each comment had seemed harmless by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Late that night, unable to sleep, I walked through my silent house checking doors and windows the way Thomas used to do. When I reached the front entrance, something caught my attention. My spare key was missing from the decorative wooden box hidden beneath the porch bench. I searched twice before accepting it was gone. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought new locks. As the locksmith finished installing them, he casually asked, "You replacing old copies?" I nodded. "How many keys did you have before?" "Only 3, I answered. "One for me, one for my late husband, one for my son." He looked surprised. "Well, somebody's definitely been using that old lock recently. See these fresh wear marks?" I stared silently at the scratched metal around the keyhole. That evening, I reviewed the footage from the small doorbell camera Lily had convinced me to install the previous Christmas. At exactly 2:17 a.m. 3 nights earlier, a familiar figure unlocked my front door with a key, stepped quietly inside, remained for 11 minutes, then left carrying nothing visible. Even through the grainy black and white recording, I recognized my own son without the slightest doubt. 3 days passed before I told anyone what I had seen on the security camera. I replayed the recording so many times that I could have counted every step Michael took across my front porch with my eyes closed. He never looked nervous. He didn't hesitate before unlocking my front door. He walked inside as though he still owned a key to my life. Every mother believes she knows her child, but there comes a moment when memory begins arguing with evidence. I wanted desperately for memory to win. On Friday morning, the same date printed on my obituary, I drove to the grocery store hoping ordinary errands would quiet the thoughts racing through my head. The summer sun hung high over Cedar Ridge, and the parking lot buzzed with families loading bags into their cars. Everything around me looked perfectly normal. That somehow made my own world feel even stranger. As I reached for a shopping cart, I heard someone call my name. "Evelyn." I turned and saw Grace Miller walking toward me. We had been neighbors for nearly 20 years before she moved across town after retiring from Riverside Medical Center. Grace had always been practical, the kind of woman who noticed details other people ignored. But the moment she saw me, all the color drained from her face. She stopped several feet away, staring as though she'd seen something impossible. "Grace," I asked gently, "are you all right?" She blinked twice before speaking. "Good Lord," she whispered. "You're alive." I laughed nervously. "Last time I checked." She didn't smile. Instead, she looked over both shoulders before stepping closer. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Her voice had lost its usual warmth. Something inside me tightened. We crossed the street to a quiet coffee shop where only a few customers sat reading newspapers. Grace waited until our drinks arrived before finally looking me straight in the eyes. "Evelyn, I need you to promise you won't interrupt until I'm finished." I slowly nodded. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. 3 days ago, I volunteered at Riverside. They asked me to organize paperwork for the bereavement office. While sorting files, I overheard someone asking questions about funeral procedures. I listened without speaking. It was Michael. My heart sank into my stomach. He wasn't arranging anything, Grace continued carefully. At least, not officially. He asked what documents families usually need after an elderly parent passes away. He wanted to know how quickly death certificates are issued. He even asked about donating medical equipment after a loved one dies. I stared at her, unable to process the words. "People ask those questions all the time," I finally said, though my voice sounded far away. Grace nodded slowly. "That's true. But then he mentioned your name." Silence settled between us. I could hear the espresso machine hissing behind the counter. "He said," Grace continued, "my mother Evelyn Harper has been declining, and I just want to be prepared." I swallowed hard. "But I haven't even been sick." That's exactly why I remembered it. Grace reached into her purse and removed a folded sheet of paper. I almost convinced myself I'd misunderstood until yesterday. She slid the page across the table. It wasn't an official hospital document. It was a printed email. Across the subject line were 6 words that made my hands turn cold. Estate Transition Timeline. Lauren Harper's name appeared beneath the sender line. The email itself wasn't long. Most of it discussed appointments, scheduling, and document preparation. Several sentences had been highlighted. Confirm appraisal after Friday. Coordinate attorney meeting. Notify realtor once transition is complete. There was no direct mention of harming anyone. Nothing openly criminal. Yet reading it after discovering my obituary felt like watching puzzle pieces fall into place one by one. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. Grace hesitated. "Someone accidentally left it on the volunteer printer. I recognized your address in one section, and I made a copy before it disappeared. I read every line again. The wording remained careful, almost clinical, as though whoever wrote it wanted to avoid saying too much. But one sentence stood out. Personal belongings may be distributed immediately following family confirmation. Family confirmation. Confirmation of what? My death? Before I could ask another question, Grace leaned closer. There's something else. I looked up. Yesterday afternoon, I attended a charity luncheon downtown. Lauren was there. Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. She gave one of your antique porcelain serving bowls to the auction committee. I frowned. That bowl belonged to my grandmother. Grace nodded. When someone complimented it, Lauren laughed and said, Evelyn won't be needing these much longer. The room suddenly felt too small. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with something colder. Disbelief. I remembered polishing that very bowl every Thanksgiving while Lily helped me arrange fresh flowers inside it. Lauren knew its history. She knew how much it meant to me. Yet she had already begun giving away pieces of my life while I was still here to remember them. Did Michael hear her say that? I asked quietly. Grace lowered her eyes. He was standing beside her. Did he say anything? She shook her head. No. We sat without speaking for nearly a minute. Outside the cafe window, children laughed as they chased pigeons across the sidewalk. Life continued as though nothing had changed. Finally, I folded the email and slipped it into my purse beside the copy of my obituary. 2 documents. 2 impossible discoveries. Neither proved exactly what was happening, but together they formed a truth I could no longer ignore. Someone had already begun planning my absence. As Grace and I walked toward the parking lot, she gently touched my arm. Evelyn, she said, whatever this is, don't face it alone. I promised I wouldn't. But as I drove home, another question kept repeating itself in my mind. If Lauren had written the email, then why had Michael allowed her to lead everything? I barely slept that weekend. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw 2 pieces of paper floating in front of me. The obituary with my smiling photograph. The email labeled estate transition timeline. Neither one directly accused anyone of a crime. Yet together they painted a picture I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. For the first time in my 71 years, I walked through my own home feeling like a guest whose departure had already been scheduled by someone else. On Saturday morning, I decided to stop guessing and start remembering. I carried a cup of coffee into the family room and sat beneath the wall covered with photographs Thomas and I had collected over nearly 5 decades of marriage. Looking at those pictures, I realized memories often tell the truth more honestly than emotions. Thomas had always noticed things before I did. During the last year of his life, after one uncomfortable Sunday dinner, he quietly said, "Promise me something, Evie." I smiled at the memory of his gentle voice. "What is it?" "Don't ever let guilt make decisions for you." At the time, I laughed and teased him for sounding mysterious. He simply squeezed my hand and changed the subject. Back then I assumed he was talking about retirement or my habit of helping everyone before helping myself. Now I wasn't so sure. As I studied the photographs, little moments I had ignored began returning with uncomfortable clarity. About 8 months earlier, Lauren had insisted on reorganizing my filing cabinet while I attended Lily's school recital. "You're keeping too much paperwork," she had said cheerfully. "I'll make everything easier for you." When I returned home, the cabinet looked spotless. She proudly showed me color-coded folders and neatly labeled drawers. I thanked her. I never stopped to ask why she had spent nearly 4 hours alone inside my house. Then there was the afternoon she offered to photograph every room in my home. She claimed Lily needed reference pictures for a school architecture project. I remembered following them from room to room, while Lauren carefully measured windows with her phone. At one point, she even opened every closet. I joked that she was more thorough than a real estate agent. She laughed much harder than the joke deserved. Another memory surfaced. Last Christmas, Michael had casually asked whether I still kept Thomas's old safe in the basement. "You should really update your records, Mom," he'd said while helping me carry decorations upstairs. It would save everyone trouble later. I smiled and promised I'd think about it. He wasn't rude. Neither was Lauren. Looking back, that was what troubled me most. Their questions had always sounded practical, caring, responsible. Each one by itself seemed perfectly reasonable. Together, they formed a map leading somewhere I had never expected. Around noon, I opened the fireproof box where Thomas had kept important family documents. His handwriting still appeared on small labels inside. insurance, mortgage, military records, wills. Beneath the folder containing our estate paperwork lay a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For Evelyn." I recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. My chest tightened as I carefully unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. "If you're reading this," he had written, "then life has probably become more complicated than either of us hoped. Remember something I've always believed. Love your family generously, but never surrender your judgment. People sometimes mistake kindness for permission. Don't let anyone convince you that your own home no longer belongs to you while you're still living inside it." Tears blurred the words for just a moment. Thomas had never distrusted Michael. Neither had I. Yet somehow those sentences felt almost prophetic. He wasn't warning me about a specific person. He was reminding me that dignity had to be protected, even from those we loved. I carefully returned the letter to its envelope before walking upstairs. As I passed my bedroom window, movement across the street caught my attention. A silver SUV sat parked near the corner. At first I assumed it belonged to a delivery driver, but several minutes passed without anyone getting out. Then a man wearing a polo shirt stepped onto my lawn carrying a clipboard. I opened the front door before he reached the porch. "Can I help you?" He smiled politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm with Horizon Property Services. I'm here to complete an exterior valuation." "For what property?" He glanced at his paperwork. "Evelyn Harper. Scheduled appointment for today." I didn't schedule anything. He frowned, obviously confused. "That's strange. We received authorization earlier this week." "From whom?" He checked his tablet. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It only lists a family representative." Family representative. My stomach sank. I thanked him and explained there had been a misunderstanding. The man apologized sincerely before driving away. I watched until his vehicle disappeared around the corner. Someone had authorized strangers to evaluate my home without even speaking to me. Later that evening, I drove past Michael's house. I hadn't planned to stop. I simply wanted to see Lily. Her bicycle still rested beside the garage. The porch lights glowed warmly against the fading sunset. Through the dining room window, I could see my son laughing at something Lauren had said. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. They looked like an ordinary family sharing an ordinary dinner. For a moment, I almost convinced myself to walk up the driveway, knock on the door, and tell them everything I knew. Then I remembered the obituary, the appraisal, the email, the missing key. I quietly drove away. The next morning, before church, I called Harold Benson, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate for years. His receptionist told me he was available Monday morning. "It's about my family's legal documents," I said calmly. "And I believe someone may be making plans that I was never meant to discover." Harold agreed to see me first thing Monday. As I hung up the phone, I realized something important. Whatever was happening, I could no longer solve it with memories alone. It was time to find out who had been writing the future while expecting me not to live long enough to read it. Harold Benson greeted me the same way he had for nearly 30 years, with a firm handshake and a calm smile that had reassured my husband through countless business meetings. His office overlooked the courthouse square in downtown Cedar Ridge, and every photograph on the wall reminded visitors of decades spent helping local families navigate life's most difficult moments. When he saw the expression on my face, his smile faded. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "something tells me this isn't a social visit." I nodded and placed 2 folders on his polished oak desk. "Before you say anything, I'd like you to read these." Harold adjusted his glasses and opened the first folder. He studied my obituary without speaking. When he reached the final page, his eyebrows drew together. Then he opened the second folder and carefully read the printed email Grace had given me. He finished both documents before leaning back in his chair. "Did you bring these directly from Michael's office?" "The obituary, yes. The email came from someone I trust." Harold remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he asked the question I had been hoping to hear. "Have you signed any new estate documents recently?" "No." "Any powers of attorney?" "No." "Any transfer of property?" "Absolutely not." He folded his hands together. "Then whoever prepared this obituary acted without my office." That answer settled one fear while creating another. "Michael said you suggested preparing it months ago." Harold slowly shook his head. "I encourage clients to discuss funeral preferences, but I never draft completed obituaries. And I certainly wouldn't place a future date of death on one." He picked up the obituary again, examining the formatting. "This wasn't prepared by me. A heavy silence settled over the room. Harold finally spoke again, his tone measured and professional. Evelyn, I can't accuse anyone of wrongdoing based on assumptions. But I can help you protect yourself. He opened my estate file from a secure cabinet behind his desk. Every document Thomas and I had signed over the years remained exactly where we had left them. Nothing had been changed. Nothing had been filed without my approval. Yet Harold noticed something unexpected. Someone called my office about 6 weeks ago asking general questions regarding your trust. Who? I asked. The caller identified herself as a family representative. My heart sank before he even finished. Lauren. Harold nodded slowly. She asked whether a trust automatically became effective after the owner's passing. My assistant explained we couldn't discuss confidential matters. Did she ask anything else? She wanted to know whether beneficiaries could begin organizing property before probate. I stared at the floor. Lauren hadn't been asking casual questions after all. She had been gathering information piece by piece from anyone she believed might answer. Harold closed the file. Here's what I recommend. Don't confront them yet. I looked up. Why not? Because right now they're comfortable. People reveal more when they believe no one suspects them. His advice sounded remarkably similar to something Thomas would have said. Before leaving, Harold suggested we quietly review every asset connected to my estate. Over the next 2 hours, we confirmed account numbers, property deeds, investment records, insurance policies, and trust provisions. Everything remained legally under my control. Then Harold pointed toward a section of the trust that Thomas himself had insisted on adding years earlier. I'd almost forgotten this clause, he admitted. I leaned closer. The paragraph stated that any beneficiary proven to have obtained financial advantage through fraud, coercion, or deliberate deception against the grantor could immediately lose all rights under the trust, subject to judicial review. Harold smiled faintly. Your husband was a careful man. I couldn't help smiling through the sadness. Thomas always said character mattered more than inheritance. Harold closed the folder. Then perhaps he planned more wisely than any of us realized. As I prepared to leave, he handed me his business card with a handwritten number on the back. This reaches me directly, day or night. If anything unusual happens, call before making any decisions. I thanked him and drove home feeling something I hadn't experienced in days. Not relief. Clarity. For the first time since discovering the obituary, I understood that my greatest protection wasn't money. It was patience. That evening my phone rang just after 6. Lauren's cheerful voice filled the kitchen. Hi, Evelyn. We're cleaning out the basement this weekend and wondered if you'd like us to help organize your attic too. I glanced toward the staircase leading upstairs. That's thoughtful, I replied evenly. But everything's fine. Are you sure? It must be exhausting keeping such a big house. Not really. She laughed softly. Well, one day we'll have to go through everything together. Her choice of words lingered in my mind after the call ended. We'll have to go through everything. Not if. When. Later that night, I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to accuse anyone without proof either. Instead, I would become exactly what they didn't expect. Invisible in plain sight. I stopped answering every phone call immediately. I declined dinner invitations with polite excuses. I quietly removed several family heirlooms from the house and placed them in Harold's secure storage without telling anyone. Grace helped me photograph every room, every valuable item, every document, creating a detailed inventory with dates and timestamps. We changed passwords, updated emergency contacts, and replaced the garage entry code. None of it felt dramatic. It felt responsible, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was growing impatient. 3 days later, Grace called before breakfast. Evelyn, she said without greeting, I just drove past the funeral home on Maple Street. And there was a pause. Michael's car is parked outside. Grace's call stayed with me long after we hung up. I stood in my kitchen staring through the window toward the backyard where Thomas used to spend every Saturday trimming the maple trees. Michael had no reason to visit the funeral home. I hadn't been diagnosed with a terminal illness. My last physical had been excellent for a woman my age. My doctor often joked that I was healthier than half his younger patients. Yet my son was sitting inside a funeral home while an obituary bearing my name waited inside a folder in his office. Every explanation I tried to invent collapsed under the weight of those facts. I decided not to drive there. Harold's advice echoed in my mind. Let them believe you know nothing. People reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. Instead, I spent the morning organizing old photographs for Lily. At least that was what anyone looking through my window would have assumed. In reality, I was making copies of family records, insurance statements, and handwritten letters Thomas had left behind. By noon, every important document had been scanned onto an encrypted drive Harold recommended. Around 2 o'clock, my doorbell rang. It was Michael. He stood on my porch carrying a paper bag from my favorite bakery. "Thought I'd surprise you," he said with an easy smile. "Blueberry scones." I invited him inside. He looked exactly as he always had, neatly dressed, polite, confident. If I hadn't discovered the obituary, I would have believed I was sharing coffee with the same son who used to bring me daisies picked from empty lots after Little League practice. We sat at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on several empty shelves where family heirlooms had quietly disappeared into Harold's secure storage. "Doing some decorating?" he asked casually. "Just cleaning," I replied. "Feels good to simplify once in a while." A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face before disappearing almost instantly. "That's probably a good idea," he said. "Big houses can become overwhelming." The sentence sounded almost identical to Lauren's. I poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Grace mentioned she saw your car near Maple Street this morning." He froze for less than a second before lifting his cup. "Oh, that." He laughed softly. "One of my clients owns the funeral home. He's reviewing a commercial insurance policy." It was a reasonable explanation. Too reasonable. "Business has you working everywhere these days," I said. "Keeps me busy." We talked about Lily's upcoming piano recital, neighborhood construction, and the unusually hot summer weather. Not once did he mention the obituary. Not once did he ask whether I'd been sleeping well after finding it. Every topic felt carefully chosen, as though invisible boundaries surrounded the conversation. Before leaving, he hugged me tightly. "Love you, Mom." "Love you too." As he stepped outside, I noticed him glance toward my detached garage. It lasted only a moment, but I had seen that look before. It was the expression Thomas wore whenever he mentally calculated measurements while planning a home improvement project. Michael wasn't admiring the garage. He was assessing it. After he drove away, I checked the small camera Harold had suggested installing above the side entrance. The recording confirmed what I'd suspected. Before ringing my doorbell, Michael had walked around the side of my house, peered through the garage window, and tried the handle on the back gate. None of it was illegal. None of it felt innocent. The following evening, Lauren invited me to dinner. "Nothing fancy," she said cheerfully over the phone. "Just family." Against every instinct telling me to decline, I accepted. If they believed I remained unsuspecting, perhaps they would stop hiding so carefully. Their dining room looked warm and welcoming when I arrived. Lily hugged me the moment I stepped inside, proudly showing me a ribbon she'd earned at piano lessons. For a few precious minutes, everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Then dinner began. Halfway through the meal, Lauren placed her fork on the table and smiled. "Michael and I have been thinking about the future." I quietly waited. "You've worked so hard your entire life," she continued. "Maybe it's time someone started helping you make the big decisions." "Such as?" I asked. "Selling the house eventually. Downsizing. Making sure everything's organized before it becomes stressful." Michael remained unusually quiet, staring at his plate. I looked at him. "Do you agree?" He hesitated before answering. "I just don't want you handling everything alone. I've been handling it alone since your father passed away." My voice remained calm. Lauren quickly jumped back into the conversation. "Exactly. And you've done an amazing job. We're only trying to protect you." Protect me. The same word appeared in almost every conversation now. Protect. Simplify. Organize. Transition. Gentle words hiding something far more complicated beneath the surface. After dessert, Lily asked me to help her find an old photo album she remembered seeing in my living room months earlier. Without thinking, Lauren answered before I could. "Those probably won't be around much longer." The room fell silent. She realized her mistake almost immediately and forced a laugh. "I mean, once everything gets reorganized." I smiled. Politely, but inside something settled into certainty. They were no longer speaking about possibilities. They were speaking about plans. That night, after returning home, I received a call from Harold. His normally steady voice carried an urgency I had never heard before. "Evelyn," he said, "I need you to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Someone contacted the county clerk this afternoon asking whether your trust documents had been updated. The request wasn't approved, but the name attached to the inquiry will interest you. I already knew whose name he was about to say. What I didn't know was how much farther this plan had already gone while everyone assumed I would never be alive to uncover it. I arrived at Harold Benson's office just after 8 the next morning. He was already waiting with a thick folder open across his desk and a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside it. The moment I sat down, he slid a printed document toward me. "Take a look at the signature block," he said quietly. I lowered my eyes and immediately recognized the name. Lauren Harper. It wasn't a legal filing or an official request. It was a written inquiry submitted through the county clerk's public records portal asking whether any amendments had recently been made to the Harper Family Trust. The request itself had been denied because she wasn't listed as an authorized party, but the timestamp showed it had been submitted less than 18 hours earlier, only a few hours after I had dinner at their house. Harold folded his hands. "Someone is actively trying to determine whether your estate plans have changed." I let out a slow breath. "Can they access anything?" "Not without your authorization." He paused before continuing. "But repeated inquiries suggest they're worried about something." "They're worried they've lost control," I answered quietly. Harold nodded. "That's my concern as well." We spent the next hour reviewing every protection built into my estate. Years earlier, Thomas had insisted that the trust include detailed documentation requirements before any distribution could occur. Every beneficiary would have to appear in person. Every transfer required verification. Every unusual circumstance triggered an independent legal review. Thomas had never explained why he wanted those safeguards. At the time, I thought he was simply being thorough. Now I silently thanked him for every extra page he had insisted upon. Before I left, Harold looked directly at me. "Evelyn, I'd like your permission to prepare one additional document." "What kind?" "A sealed statement confirming that you're mentally competent, acting voluntarily, and have expressed concerns regarding possible future financial pressure." I understood immediately. If anyone later claimed I had been confused or manipulated, there would already be a professionally documented record proving otherwise. "Prepare it," I said without hesitation. Harold smiled faintly. "I already have." After signing the statement, I drove home through familiar streets that somehow no longer felt familiar. Every stop sign, every storefront, every neighbor walking a dog reminded me that ordinary life continued while invisible decisions unfolded behind closed doors. I refused to become afraid inside my own town. Instead of going straight home, I stopped at Grace's house. She welcomed me inside before I even knocked, as though she'd been expecting me. Her kitchen smelled of fresh cinnamon bread, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself to sit quietly, without constantly scanning every conversation for hidden meaning. I told her everything Harold had discovered. Grace listened carefully before asking one question I hadn't considered. "Have you ever wondered whether Michael knows everything Lauren has been doing?" I looked down at my coffee. "Every day. Because there are two possibilities," she continued gently. "Either they're planning everything together, or one of them is making decisions the other only partly understands." I thought back to every uncomfortable dinner, every awkward pause, every moment Michael had allowed Lauren to answer questions directed at him. He had rarely initiated those conversations. Lauren almost always had, yet he never stopped them either. "If he's being manipulated," I said slowly, "he's still choosing to stay silent." Grace nodded sadly. "Silence has consequences." That afternoon, I returned home and decided to organize several boxes stored in the attic. Most contained old family photographs, children's drawings, and holiday decorations. Near the back of one dusty shelf, I found a small wooden keepsake box Thomas had built during retirement. Inside rested birthday cards Michael had written decades earlier, crayon drawings, Father's Day crafts, a crooked handwritten note from second grade that read, "When I grow up, I want to take care of you and Dad forever." I smiled through tears. I believed that little boy had meant every word. Somewhere along the way, life had become more complicated than promises made with crayons. As evening approached, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Can I stop by tomorrow? Need to discuss something important." I stared at the screen for several moments before replying. "Of course." The next afternoon, he arrived alone. Lauren wasn't with him. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and he seemed older than his 44 years. We sat on the back porch overlooking Thomas's garden. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. Mom, have you ever thought about moving somewhere smaller? I almost smiled at the predictability of the question. You've asked me that before. I know. He rubbed his hands together nervously. It's just, maintenance gets harder every year. For me or for you? He looked away toward the fence. For everyone. There it was again. That careful language. Never direct. Never honest enough to reveal what lay underneath. I answered softly. This house isn't difficult for me, Michael. It's full of memories. Your father built that deck with his own hands. You learned to ride your bike on this driveway. Lily planted those tulips with me last spring. Why would I rush to leave? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee cup and stared into it. Sometimes holding on to the past keeps people from preparing for the future. I studied my son's face. He sounded less like himself and more like someone repeating advice he'd heard many times before. Before I could respond, his phone vibrated on the table. Lauren's name flashed across the screen. He rejected the call without answering. 10 seconds later, it rang again. He sighed heavily and stood up. I should probably get going. As he walked toward his car, I called after him. Michael. He turned. If you ever need to tell me the truth about something, you don't have to ask anyone's permission first. For just a moment, his expression changed. The confident businessman disappeared, replaced by the uncertain little boy who used to confess broken windows before I even noticed them. His lips parted as though he wanted to speak. Instead, he simply nodded, climbed into his car, and drove away. I watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner, unable to shake the feeling that whatever happened next would finally reveal whether I was losing only my daughter-in-law or my son as well. The morning after Michael left my house, I walked through every room before the sun had fully risen. I paused in the kitchen where Thomas and I had shared thousands of breakfasts, ran my hand along the worn banister he had refinished himself, and stood quietly in the doorway of Lily's favorite guest room. For days I had been asking myself what truly frightened me. It wasn't the possibility of losing money. It wasn't even the thought of losing my home. It was realizing that someone I loved had begun making plans for my future without believing I deserved a voice in it. That kind of loss couldn't be measured on a financial statement. Later that afternoon, Michael called and asked if he could stop by again. His voice sounded different, stripped of the confidence he usually carried. When he arrived, he didn't bring coffee or pastries. He simply stood on the porch with both hands in his pockets. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded and invited him inside. We sat at the dining table where he had once done homework while Thomas patiently explained algebra problems. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Michael reached into his jacket and placed a folded envelope on the table. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not just for one thing. For a lot of things." I didn't interrupt. Lauren kept telling me. We needed to prepare for the future. She said we were being responsible. She wanted information about the trust, the house, your accounts. Every step sounded reasonable by itself. He rubbed his forehead. I told myself we were helping you. Then it became easier not to ask why everything had to happen so quickly. I looked directly at him. "Did you know about the obituary?" He closed his eyes for a moment before answering. I knew she had someone draft it. She said families often prepare those things in advance. I thought it was strange, but I didn't stop it. His honesty hurt more than another lie would have. "And the appraisal?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Lauren arranged it. She said it would save time later." "Later," I repeated softly. After I was gone. Tears filled his eyes. "Mom, I never wanted anything to happen to you. But you accepted plans that treated my life like a date on a calendar." He lowered his head. "Yes." The room remained silent except for the ticking clock Thomas had repaired countless times over the years. After several minutes, I slid another envelope across the table. Inside was a copy of the trust clause Harold had shown me. Michael read it carefully, stopping when he reached the section concerning fraud, coercion, and deliberate deception. "Dad wrote this?" he asked. He insisted it be included. Michael looked around the room as though he could almost hear his father's voice. He always said integrity mattered more than money. He did. Michael wiped his eyes. "Lauren doesn't know I'm here." I guessed as much. He hesitated before continuing. "She believes you're changing your estate because someone has been influencing you." I smiled sadly. The only people who tried to influence me were the ones already making decisions about my future. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to defend. Before leaving, He quietly placed his house key on the table. I shouldn't have kept a copy after you changed the locks. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. He wasn't asking for immediate forgiveness. He was accepting responsibility for crossing a boundary that should never have been crossed. A week later, through Harold's guidance, I updated several practical details in my estate plan. My charitable gifts remained exactly as Thomas and I had intended. Lily's education fund remained untouched. The trust protections stayed firmly in place. The only significant change was simple. No one would ever again be able to make decisions about my property, finances, or medical care without my direct written consent while I was alive and competent. Harold smiled after I signed the final document. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about making sure your wishes stay your wishes." He was right. I never sought revenge. I wanted clarity. As for Lauren, she never came to my house again. Harold later informed me that her attempts to access trust information had been formally documented and denied. She remained part of Michael's life, but no longer had any pathway into mine unless trust could someday be rebuilt through actions rather than explanations. Whether that day ever comes isn't something I can predict. Michael still visits occasionally. Sometimes we drink coffee in the backyard where Thomas planted the maple trees decades ago. Our conversations are quieter now, less comfortable, perhaps, but far more honest. Trust, I have learned, doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It fades through small compromises that seem harmless until they aren't. Rebuilding it happens the same way, one truthful decision at a time. Every so often I open the drawer where I keep the copy of that obituary. I no longer see it as a prediction of my death. I see it as the day an illusion ended. The woman described in those pages never truly existed. She was a version of me that others believed they could quietly replace with paperwork and assumptions. The real Evelyn Harper was still standing, still thinking, still choosing her own future. And as long as I have that choice, no one else gets to write the final chapter of my story. Thank you for spending your time with me and following this journey to the end. If this story touched you in any way, I'd love to have you here for the next one. Please consider subscribing, and if you'd like, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. I'd truly enjoy reading your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.